Welcome back, class. This is going to be Chapter 4, Business in a Global Economy. So, what are our main learning objectives for today? First, we're going to define what globalization is. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to try to tackle is we're going to try to identify the implications of global markets. What does it mean to have global production, and explain why it has accelerated so quickly? Probably in the last 10 to 20 years. Foreign companies are continuously coming and competing in U.S. markets, which is increasing competition. It's putting more pressure on U.S. businesses. And so the question is this beneficial uh, to U.S. trade? Is it beneficial to international trade? So what are the benefits? What are the costs? Okay. Um, Then we're going to talk about international trade for a little bit and the difference between viewing international trade as compared to domestic trade. So, sometimes folks will look at something and say, that's terrible for the US economy, but they're not asking, uh, is it terrible for the global economy, right? So there is a difference between the two, all right? Then the third objective is free trade and protectionism. So when we try to compete in a world market, it means that we have to use everything available, all our resources that we have. Um, so what we have to consider is are we utilizing all that we have um, at an optimum level? This is sometimes referred to as utility maximization. Okay, so how does free trade affect businesses? Does it force businesses to maximize their utility um, or not, and why? Then we're going to discuss uh, international business, uh, and we're going to look at the three basic strategies of international business and describe how international firms typically enter foreign markets and the um, sequence that they typically go through. It's not always the same for everyone. Uh, but there's a typical sequence that we see. And then lastly, we're going to discuss what it means to be successful uh, conducting or creating international business. So there's some key factors that we have been able to hone in on over the past few years to determine if someone is successful at being an international business. All right, so let's hop in. So, what is globalization? Okay, globalization is the movement toward a more interconnected and interdependent world economy. All right. So, as I mentioned on the first slide, um, we first have to differentiate between when we say globalization of markets and globalization of production. They are not one and the same. All right. So, when we talk about globalization as a whole, um, we are talking about any type of business that has gone from being domestic to international, but that does not necessarily mean that we're talking about international competition, at least not yet. All right. So, for example, your figure discusses that sometimes things say that they're made in America, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everything that's every little component, every little piece of that item is made in America. And they use the example of Ford. And they say that even though Ford says that they make their vehicles here, a lot of the components, the computer chips, the really small pieces, a lot of the production items, if you will, are oftentimes made elsewhere and shipped here. And in other times, it might be made in the U.S., but assembled outside of the US. And this is falls more along the lines of um, the globalization of production. So the globalization of production refers to when individual firms, and we are talking about US because we're in the United States, so when individual firms in the US move their production to different locations around the globe to take advantage of lower cost or to enhance the quality of their products because um, maybe there's another country that has a comparative advantage in the production of a particular part or a particular technology. Maybe they're better at it. Maybe not. Maybe they're not better at creating the whole thing, but maybe they're better at creating one thing. All right. Now, this is not to be confused with the globalization of markets, which refers to the movement away from thinking of the market as a local market, which is what a lot of us do, especially because, you know, the USA is, if you, for all intents and purposes, the United States is kind of a nation of nations. We call ourselves a nation of free states, but if you look at other parts of the world, we are really a nation of nations because when you look at a lot of other nations, they're the size of our states. And so that's what makes us so different. But it's also what leads us to have a very acute perspective on what it means um, to view a national economy or a local economy. Okay. And so when we talk about the globalization of markets, we have to shift away from thinking about our own domestic economy and we have to start thinking about an international or a global economy. How does the things that take place, the business that takes place in our country, um, how does that impact businesses and the economy in other countries? How does the trade that we have, like our imports and exports, how does that impact other countries, and so on? If you've taken an intro to economics course, like a survey of economics course, then hopefully were, uh, you definitely were, as a matter of fact, exposed to some of this. If you haven't, then I highly recommend taking it. Okay, so basically, globalization is why you'll notice that many products um, that are made in other countries end up in the US. Why? Because at some point or another, a company realized that it was more efficient to make that item outside of the US and then sell it here. Okay? So globalization is impacting everything. It's impacting our individual lives. It's impacting the way companies do business, domestically and overseas. So you may be familiar with these two terms. We hear them a lot when we hear about foreign business, and a lot of times students get them confused. There is a difference between offshoring and outsourcing. Okay, um, so when you hear the term outsourcing, that is when a company is assigning tasks, such as production or accounting, to an outside organization. Okay, that is not to be confused with offshoring. All right, offshoring is when a company uh, actually moves their own production or some other function. They move their actual, an entity of their business, if you will, from a domestic site to a foreign location. So let me give you an example because there is a very big difference between these two things. So we were just talking about Ford. Let's say that Ford had a manufacturing and production facility that assembled its vehicles in the US. And let's say that they found out that they could build a similar facility in Mexico, um, and staff that facility and assemble those same vehicles for a fraction of the cost. And so once they determined that it would be financially beneficial to the company, they did exactly that. They purchased land, They, hired contractors to build the facility. They then decide to shut down the domestic facility. They give the employees at that facility an option to move to Mexico or um, or to take a severance package and find another job. And then, a few months down the road, they're up and running again, but they're up and running now in a foreign country. That is an example of offshoring. And offshoring means that the company maintains authority or autonomy over what's happening. It's happening in a foreign country instead of in a domestic one. Um, that is not the same thing as outsourcing. All right. Outsourcing is when a company, let's stay with Ford, because I think it's always good to stick with the same example. Let's say that Ford realizes that they're spending a considerable amount of money every year doing their own taxes, cooking their own books, if you will. And they ask themselves, they say, should we really be spending all of this money hiring accountants to maintain our books and to do our taxes? Or would it be um, you know, more fiscally sound if we hired a third party accounting firm who doesn't work for us? They're their own firm, but we're going to hire them to do all of our accounting needs. We're going to send them all the information, but we're going to let them do it. And if they don't do it well, we'll fire them and we'll hire someone else. Okay? This is referred to as outsourcing. So outsourcing, the biggest difference, if you're going to take away a difference between these two things, the biggest difference is most companies try to identify what it is they are in the business of doing. We learned about this early on in this class, right? So when a company uh, is sitting down um, and they are writing their mission statement. That mission statement says to the world, this is what I do. This is what I'm here. This is the problem that I am here to solve. Well, in a lot of cases, that businesses will find themselves bleeding, if you will, trying to do things that they are not the best at. So if we stick with our metaphor or our example, Ford is in the business of making cars and trucks. They are not in the business of accounting. And so what some businesses will do is they will say, I'm not in this business. I want to hire someone who is in this business, and I want to pay them to do it. And odds are, if they're as good as they say they are, they're going to save me money because they're going to do it right, and they're going to do it right the first time. And so at the end of the day, I can focus on what I do best, and I'm going to pay them to focus on what they do best. And when all is said and done, I'm going to be better off, and so are they. That is outsourcing. Offshoring is the flip side to that coin. It's when Ford sits down, let's say they've already outsourced their accounting, but then they say, I'm in the business of making vehicles. And when I try to do that domestically, it's so expensive because the cost of labor and the cost of land and so on is so high where I'm trying to do business in the United States. But then if I look over there at my neighbor, if I look at Mexico, wow, the cost of land there is cheaper. People who live there are willing to work for less. The raw materials that I need seem to be cheaper over there than they are here. What if I relocated my facility there? What would happen? Well, if everything's cheaper there, well, then the cost of production is going to be cheaper. That's going to lower my profit or increase my profit margins, especially as long as free trade exists between Mexico and the United States. Because as long as free trade exists, then there's no penalty for shipping my goods across uh, the border, right? And so that's what offshoring is. And that's what free trade has really led to. It's led to these two things happening: outsourcing, which can happen inside and outside of the United States. So if we stick with our Ford example, Ford doesn't have to outsource to another country to be considered outsourcing. They can outsource to an accounting firm domestically. But offshoring actually involves moving an entity or a function to another country, and that more often than not happens when there are when there is free trade and there is no restriction to trade. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by restrictions to trade in a little bit. All right, moving forward. So why do you think it is that globalization has accelerated? All right. Well, like we were just talking, um, trade and investment barriers are on a decline. So a long time ago, governments would restrict trade a number of different ways. They would restrict trade using tariffs, which is just a fancy word for um, taxes. They might limit the number of goods that could flow across borders. They might limit the services that a country could offer to another country, right? And they could limit the amount of foreign capital, right? So when we talk about foreign capital, we're talking about currency. So governments have the ability to limit the amount of currency that flows out of the country and back into the country, right? And in the past, a lot of countries were doing just that. They were putting barriers up because they were terrified that if they didn't, that it would hurt the local economy. And then what we've seen over the past 10 or 20 years is with these free trade agreements like NAFTA is a good example, we've seen a decrease or a decline in those barriers, right? And why have we seen that decline? Well, we've seen it for a number of reasons. One, because global business is cheaper for businesses, maybe not necessarily for governments, but for businesses, it's cheaper. And why is it cheaper? Well, like I said before, what we see that other countries have a comparative advantage one way or the other. If you haven't taken economics, then what you need to know, the fundamentals, is that every country tends to have an absolute advantage in something, but even those countries that don't have an absolute advantage in making something will always have a comparative advantage, right? So I know I'm speaking in hypotheticals, so let me really lay it out for you. A lot of people think that the United States is the best at doing everything, and I'm not here to argue why that may or may not be true. But what I can argue through economic theory is that regardless of whether or not the US is the best at everything, they cannot have a comparative advantage in everything. Why is that? Because of trade-offs and opportunity costs. All right, and this is really digging deep into economic theory here. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but ultimately, what it boils down to is that you know you might have country A and country B. Country A might be the best at making cars and making computers, um, and maybe country B can't do either of those better. However, you can only do so much of one and so much of the other. And so, whatever you're truly best at, you want to focus on that because the time that you give up uh, not focusing on that and focusing on the other task means that you're giving up what you do best at. And if we look at the secondary country, they hold a comparative advantage because when they give up that same amount of time, they're not losing as much of the primary thing that they do best. And so that comparative advantage allows them to um, make business more efficient, cheaper, and easier to do if we allow them to do what they have a comparative advantage in. Now, I don't have a slide that goes along with all of this. If you want to know more about the differences between absolute and comparative advantages, please email me, and I'm happy to send you some tutorial videos that go into this much more. But I guess the biggest takeaway is that when countries lower trade barriers and let international firms move their production facilities to where it makes the most sense, right? Where to the countries that have the comparative advantage because they have the lowest cost, then the world market benefits as a whole because everybody is able to do what they do best. And this used to not be such a simple thing. But because technological innovations have been happening at such a high rate, it has made it possible for companies to be able to manage and oversee global production, global marketing, um, to an extent that we've never seen before, right? And that is the reason why globalization is accelerating right now. It's because of these technological innovations, our abilities to communicate very quickly, uh, and to be able to transport goods very quickly, right? So hopefully that all makes sense. All right, so let's keep moving. So like I said, uh, hold on. There we go. All right, so there's some trends that your book discusses. Okay, there's four primary trends. So first, there's a growing role for developing nations. So what we're seeing, and this is all synonymous with the business life cycle that we studied already, or that we at least we were exposed to it in chapter 1. So if you imagine the business life cycle, it doesn't matter what business you're in, that when it first comes into fruition, if you will, um, there's a rapid increase in activity, right, in production. But then at some point, there is a maturity. There's a point where um, business slows down, okay? And what we are seeing is that nations that were in the development stage, um, like 100 years ago, uh, for example, the United States, because we're still a very young nation, things are starting to slow down. And unfortunately, when you're based on a capitalistic and consumeristic approach, you need to continue to, produce products or sell services rapidly to stay, you know, to stay the top, if you will, like to continue the economic growth that you had set. Otherwise, you will begin to stagnate. And that's kind of what we're beginning to see in the United States now. But businesses in the United States have figured out another way to continue to uh, do business and to generate profit streams. And the first one is looking at other developing nations, so nations that haven't really peaked the way that we have begun to peak, right? So in the last decade, uh, U.S. dominance of world output and world exports has actually declined, um, in relative terms to the rapid growth of countries like the ones shown here. Why is that? Well, because we went through that growth stage, over the past 100 years, and now there's other countries who are trying to play catch up, right? And so what this has led to a rise in non-US foreign direct investment. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit more about what that exactly that is on a later slide, but for now, just understand that foreign direct investment is the purchasing of property or businesses in foreign nations. Okay, and this foreign direct investment is also on the decline. So what we've seen is domestic companies who were originally shifting their investments away from the United States to other countries, to these other developing nations. But then we're seeing a reversal where now other nations have benefited from that growth, from that development, and are now flowing and investing their money and operations in the United States. But you have to understand something there. They are still foreign entities who are simply buying up property or creating production sites in the United States, right? And so that means they don't necessarily represent the American economy. They might interact with it the same way that American businesses interact with foreign economies, but they're not necessarily lending to our GDP because what they're really doing is they're supplying foreign goods that are being purchased with domestic currency. So these are some changes that we're seeing. And so we are seeing a rise in the non-US multinational corporation or enterprise. Those terms are used interchangeably. So before you had US multinational corporations or enterprises, which are businesses that would manufacture and market products in more than one country, but they were 100% based out of the US. Now we're seeing an increase in non-US multinational corporations or enterprises, okay, that are doing business in more than one country, but are not based in the US, okay? So we are seeing growth and development worldwide and not necessarily just in the US now, okay? And so, lastly, the last trend that we're seeing is an increase in democracy. Okay? Because what other nations are trying to do is they're trying to adopt the same model that America used over the past 100 years elsewhere. That's the free market economy, right? So there are more and more nations that are becoming free market economies. There's more and more governments that are considering democracy because, um, democracy lends very well to a free market economy. And what this is doing is it's stimulating the global economy as a whole. Okay, so this brings me back to what I was talking about before. Sorry, I guess I got ahead of myself. But this brings me back to the theories of absolute and comparative advantage. So if you were having a hard time following along before, now we see that they have their very own slide. Okay, so there's a lot of economic theory surrounding international trade, but like I said before, the theory of comparative advantage is one that reigns supreme and actually argues for free trade. All right. And this is not to be confused with competitive advantage. So if you've ever been exposed to competitive advantage, that is not the same thing as comparative advantage. So I don't want you to get those terms confused. A competitive advantage is what enables one business in a particular market to excel above other businesses. Okay. So there's a million examples out there. um, I guess one of the most dominant examples is likely Apple. So Apple is seen basically by everyone as the premium product um, in the smartphone field. Most people think that having an iPhone is considered to be a premium. And then I'm sure you have your Samsung folks that would like to argue against that. And I'll leave that argument to happen outside of class. Um, but at the end of the day, Apple tends to charge a premium for its products because it believes that it has more quality and a competitive advantage in its smartphone market. All right. That is not the same thing as a comparative advantage. When we discuss comparative advantage, we mean that a country can produce a good or service relatively more efficiently when compared to another country, right? And again, if you think back to my example earlier, this is not to be confused with absolute advantage, which is the ability of a country to produce more of a good or service than any other country. So, like I said before, I'll use another example. Even if America can produce more hot dogs and more hamburgers, right? We'll use hot dogs and hamburgers. So, even if we can produce more hot dogs and hamburgers than any other country, we have to be better at one of them. And since we're better at one of them, then that means that another country must have a comparative advantage in the other. So let's say that even though America is better at making hot dogs and hamburgers than everybody, it's also better at making hot dogs than it is hamburgers, right? It's better than everybody at both, but it excels at hot dogs more than hamburgers. Well, that means that there is an opportunity cost anytime that it stops making hot dogs to make hamburgers, right? So we're limited in the resources that we have, and anytime that we move away from doing what we do best, which is make hot dogs, and we're trying to make hamburgers, we're giving up more hot dogs. Well, if we look to another country and we say, well, what happens when you switch away from making hot dogs to make hamburgers? Well, the opportunity cost is lower when they switch because we're better at making hot dogs than them, which means when they switch, they lose less than we lose. And I know this is really tough to comprehend. And again, shoot me an email if I'm just you know, confusing you so much. I'll try to send you some tutorial videos that explain this a little bit better. But what that means is that means that there has to be a country out there that has a comparative advantage at making hamburgers, which then we're going to let them do so that we can focus on making hot dogs. And in the end, we both end up better because we both focus on what we do best. Even if it's relatively what we do best, it's still what we do best, efficiently and effectively, right? So at the end of the day, each country ends up with a greater quantity and a higher quality uh, set of products at lower prices than they would have been if they did not trade with each other at all. And that is why globalization is so important to all nations. Because even if there is a nation who is better at all things than every other nation, they still could be better as a whole by opening up trade, by establishing free trade and working with other countries. Okay, there's mathematical proof that is not included in your book. So if you still disagree with this because I didn't show you the numbers, please shoot me an email. I can send you mathematical proof of this theory. It's a theory that's actually true. Okay, so in most nations, governments focused on improving the nation's resources, their national resources, their labor, uh, their capital, which can be like their infrastructure, their properties, their equipment, their technology, their innovation. But the goal is to, all in all, to improve competitiveness. And what economic theory tells us is that if you focus on what you do best and trade with others who also focus on what they do best, then we are all better off. Okay, so that's essentially what this portion of the chapter is focused on. So what does that lead to? Okay, it the benefits of international trade include much more than comparative advantage. All right, it also means that countries will experience higher standards of living. Why? Because the greater quantity and variety of high quality products offered at lower prices means that more and more people get quality products and can afford a higher level of living because the cost of that living is lower. Okay, this also happens because of increased competition. Okay, and that increased competition comes from foreign trade. Now, there are also costs of foreign trade. Okay, those costs involve the livelihoods of the people who currently work in a domestic market where maybe foreign business has come in and started to compete. When that happens, domestic businesses might lose a portion of their market share, and this will stunt their profitability and their ability to either create or sustain jobs. Okay, now a lot of people see this happening and they say, well, where are those people supposed to go? They've lost their job, right? People who maybe had a job for a number of years and suddenly they lose it, and the skills that they acquired during that time are not transferable to another company. This is, unfortunately, this is a cost of free trade or international trade. Okay, that doesn't mean that those people can't ultimately find new jobs, what it means is that there is a pause or a delay in the domestic economy where uh, where our market, if you will, like if we're talking about the US, must realize how to create new opportunities and new trainings for those folks so that we as a country can continue to do what we do best. Okay. So many of you may be familiar that with this exact concept because we've been experiencing it for the past probably 20 years, probably for the majority of your life. And so, what we've seen, if we're only going to focus on the US, because this is happening worldwide, but if we're going to focus on the US, what we're seeing a decrease in production, but we're seeing an increase in innovation and services, right? So America is becoming more and more service oriented while they are offshoring the production of goods. So if you have a family member or know someone or have ever heard of someone losing a production oriented job, and not being able to find work, what they have been forced to do is either get short term job training or return to get a higher education so that they can actually take the jobs that are available because there are loads of jobs available, but our workforce doesn't necessarily have the skills when they leave a production job and try to transition to a job that's in technology or service or innovations, right? Design and innovation. So that's what we're witnessing. We're witnessing a transition, a shift. And that's always hard when when your family or someone is impacted by that directly. Okay. Um, but it doesn't mean it's the end of the world. If you understand the bigger picture, then you realize that that international trade, what it does is it's forcing countries to get better at what they do best in order to continue to compete on a global scale. And when we do that, it actually creates new opportunities for those countries, right? And so, an example that's provided in your book is that even though the US is losing jobs to production, those lost jobs are actually leading to higher paying jobs in other sectors. But those individuals do have to, acquire the skills necessary to obtain them. So there is a cycle, there is a reason, there is a purpose. It's not um, because, you know, people don't care. And I think that sometimes that's the message that gets received. All right, let's get to our next slide. So we've been talking a lot about international trade and globalization. So we need to go back to the fundamentals. I kind of wish that they had brought these up at the beginning, but it's okay as long as we touch on it. So what is free trade? Well, free trade is an unencumbered flow of goods and services across national borders. So basically, it's when businesses are allowed to send their goods or services from one country to the next without any restriction whatsoever. Okay? But here's the deal. Free trade, it's more idealistic because one way or another, just about every country limits free trade to some extent. Okay? And they do so through the use of trade barriers. I mentioned one of those already, and that's tariffs. So tariffs, that's just a fancy word for taxes. And it's a fancy word for taxes that are imposed on imported goods or services or exported goods or services. Okay? These are the most common trade barrier. Governments prefer to impose tariffs because it raises tax revenues for the government, which means they make money when goods cross the border. And then they use that money for all different sorts of purposes, right? It also restricts the number of goods, right? Because if there's higher taxes for every good that crosses a border, then that's obviously going to limit the number of goods that's going to cross that border by raising the tax rate. All right. But there's other ways. Governments also use subsidies. Okay. Subsidies are government payments to domestic producers to help them remain competitive against foreign competitors. Okay, so what does that look like? Well, we are in the South, so maybe you've heard of this before, maybe you know someone, but our government pays farmers or agricultural folks subsidies to keep making crops even if they're not all going to be used up. Or sometimes they'll even pay farmers subsidies to not make crops, to not operate at their maximum capacity, if you will, right? So let's say if I'm uh, a potato farmer and I have 25 acres. I know that's not very big for a farm. Well, the government could come in and say, we don't want you to crop all 25 acres that you own. We'll pay you to not crop 10 of them and only do 15 this year. Well, what this does is this allows the government once again to control the amount of goods that are flowing in the economy, but it also allows them to inject capital into domestic business while limiting, which increases their competitiveness against any foreign entities that might be trying to uh, lurk in, if you will. So that's another example of a trade barrier. Then there are quotas. Okay, a quota is a quantity limitation on the amount of an import allowed to enter a country. So instead of using subsidies or using taxes to discourage the amount of goods that are flowing into a country, we can just slap a number on it and say, you know what? Um, you're only allowed to import 100 potatoes. If you import 101, we're sending one back, right? So that's a more deliberate and direct way to limit foreign trade because you can actually put a limit or a threshold on that good or service. Okay, and then last, let's see. Well, it's not last, but the very last trade barrier is a little different than the previous one. So I was going to say the last one that we really see is an embargo. Now, this doesn't happen very often. This typically happens when there's some type of um, political dispute between leaders of a country. We've seen it happen with the current president in China. Uh, so we see actual embargoes, which are total restrictions on imports or exports. Okay, so that means that you are not allowed to send that good to my country at all, or you are not allowed to buy this good from my country. I'm not allowing you to buy it one way or the other. That is considered a trade embargo. And then the last one is kind of like like it's not really a full trade barrier. It's more of like a smaller one, if you will. But the local content requirement is just pardon me. It's just a requirement that some portion of goods be produced domestically, which is kind of the same thing as subsidies. It's just more of a direct, um, it's almost like a quota and a subsidy together. They're not paying for the production of a good. They're basically saying that we can't limit the number coming in or going out, but we can say that a certain number has to be made domestically in order for the economy to be whole. Okay. So these are all the barriers to free trade, and we see them with every country, not just the United States. Every country uses these barriers for a number of different reasons. Okay, so that leads us to our next topic, which is protectionism. Okay, protectionism, let's see, is when we increase sales and create greater profits for domestic companies which creates job security for workers. However, consumers see a lower quantity, a lower variety, and a lower quality of goods at higher prices. Okay, so that's what protectionism is. All right, And the opposite, if you will, is free trade. Okay? Free trade is when we see a greater quantity, a greater variety, a higher quality of goods at lower prices. Okay? So that's the opposite, if you will. So there's always cost with whichever direction a government chooses to go. When we talk about free trade, what we see is reduced sales and lower prices um, domestically because of foreign competition. So when we allow foreign competitors to compete in a domestic economy, that if they have a comparative advantage in the production of a good, that means they're going to be able to charge lower prices and make the same profit or profit margin. And so what that does is that forces domestic businesses to also lower their prices, but they can't lower their cost, or they try to. But that will limit the domestic company's profitability, which then lowers job security because it could result in domestic companies closing. Okay. Um, then, if we look on the flip side of the coin, right, protectionism, um, it protects the local economy, right? You see greater profits for the companies, but again, um, the products that we see and the services that we see, they can charge higher prices for lower quality and lower quantities. Why? Because that's almost monopolistic in nature. If you view a domestic economy like you would like a single company operating in a market, it's almost like having a monopoly on all the consumers that are inside that local economy. Okay, so that's how that is able to happen. So these are the differences. These are the ends or the poles, if you will, of trade. So on the one end, we have 100% free trade. On the other end, we have 100% protectionism. And what we see with most countries is we see something along the middle, right? We see some moderation of both. Okay, so what we've seen and what you'll see in your chapter is that there are four main arguments that exist for trade barriers. The first is national security. So the national security argument states that certain industries that are critical to national security should be protected from foreign competition. All right. There's also the infant industry argument. That argument states that an undeveloped domestic industry should be given time to grow and should be given time to develop so that it can acquire a comparative advantage when compared to the global economy. So if we allow free trade, then free trade will allow foreign competitors to come in and destroy that infant industry before it has a chance to get on its feet. Okay? Then there is the cheap foreign labor argument. This argument centers on the sometimes significantly lower wages paid to workers of foreign companies. Okay? Lastly, there is the threat of retaliation. This is also known as the bargaining chip argument. That argument says, oh, hold on one second. Sorry about that. Um, so the bargaining chip argument says that if a trading partner increases its trade barriers on your exports or fails to reduce trade barriers as you reduce yours, then there is an uneven, unfair playing field. Okay? Domestic companies may also be put to a disadvantage if a foreign firm is dumping its product. Your book defines dumping as selling a product at a price that is below the price charged in the producing country. It is illegal and can be difficult to prove, but the intent of dumping is to dominate an industry and then control it. Okay? So basically what if you're not familiar with this concept, what it means is I'm so profitable in a product that I make that I can afford to sell it at below cost for a certain amount of time. Obviously, I can't afford to do it forever, but my goal is not to do it forever. It is just to do it long enough to put someone else out of business. Once I've put them out of business, I am my own monopoly in that market, right? And then I can raise the prices back up at will without threat of competition. And remember, if there's no threat of competition, there's no there's no hindrance on the price levels that I can set, right? So that's what they're referring to when they talk about dumping. So, all in all, to summarize this slide, just know that the threat of trade barriers can be risky, right? And it can oftentimes lead to a trade war. So, while governments use protectionism to argue for certain trade barriers, there are a lot of risky outcomes that can happen if a government goes overboard. Now, you've heard me say time and time again um, throughout this lesson that a lot of this is based on economic theory. Okay? Most economists advocate for free trade. Why? Because economists believe that the benefits of free trade outweigh any of the costs. Okay? So if you're a believer in economic theory, then you believe that trade barriers benefit domestic producers and their workers, but ultimately hurt domestic consumers, the people, the folks who are buying the products or services. Okay, economists insist that the best way to address the concerns of those industries and their workers whose livelihoods are threatened by foreign competition is not to use protectionism. Instead, they suggest that displaced workers need to be equipped with education and training and skills necessary to smooth their transition into the new line of work or business in which the nation has a comparative advantage. This is what I was mentioning earlier. This is what an educated individual is able to look at what's going on in their country from a bird's eye view and comprehend that jobs are not lost, they are only transitioned. Okay? Not lost, transitioned. All right? So, while governments have protectionist trade barriers in place, they they have been working to reduce them because they understand the economic benefits of doing business internationally and how they actually lower costs in the long term. Okay, so this is why we see a trend toward reduced trade and investment globally. And that's what is fueling globalization because the folks who understand this, who understand the theories behind comparative advantage and free trade, understand that there may be some short term disruptions, but we are going to see long term profitability and growth. Okay. All right, let's keep moving. There are several organizations out there, international organizations, that promote free trade. One of the most well known ones is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT. It was created in 1948. There are 23 member nations when it was originally created. There are now 123. Okay, or there were in 1994, excuse me. Um, it was not an organization that was meant to enforce anything. Um, it had 8 rounds of treaties. Those treaties successfully reduced tariffs and other barriers on trade. Unfortunately, GATT was not successful in reducing trade barriers on services or protecting intellectual property rights or enforcing uh, agreements on member nations. So, member nations might have signed a treaty saying that they would do something, but then there was no authoritative power when it was the general agreement on tariffs and trade. But then um, in 1950, we see this transition from GATT to the World Trade Organization. This transition happened uh, because it was necessary to strengthen the world trading system, but also there was obviously a need to increase rules, autonomy, um, and there was a need to be able to protect services, intellectual property, and so on. So the World Trade Organization took on this responsibility, and now they arbitrate trade disputes and monitor trade policies between member countries. They still operate as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades did when it comes to dispute settlements, but they now have the power to enforce decisions. So that's really the biggest difference between GATT and the WTO. In today's economy, the greatest free trade area exists among member nations of the European Union, which is the oldest and largest free trade area. The European Union's predecessor, which was the European Economic Community or the Common Market, was actually created in 1957. It was created with Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. Today, the European Union has grown to its current membership of 28 countries. Its success is due in large part to its demonstrated commitment to the free trade or free flow of goods and services and capital across all country borders in Europe. The European Union is currently the world's largest single market, with approximately one-third of the world's total production. The European Union is also the largest exporter in the world and the second largest importer. In 1999, the European Union surpassed all other free trade areas with respect to economic integration by adopting a common currency. This is known as the euro. Okay? The euro is currently used by 18 of the 28 member states and has become a major currency in all global markets. The European Union has a population of nearly 500 million people and is expected to continue to grow as many other nations apply to join the union. The North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, is also one of the largest free trade agreements between countries that exist. It exists between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, and it is closer to true free trade. NAFTA was established in 1994 after considerable political opposition, but the experience of NAFTA so far indicates that earlier claims made by both advocates and critics were exaggerated. So both sides were kind of wrong or, were stretching the truth. However, this free trade between our three countries has quadrupled to more than $19 million. So to say that it has been unsuccessful would be nonsense. We also see other large free trade agreements in other portions of the world. There is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. This includes Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, Brunei, Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar, and Cambodia. Progress toward integration has been very limited. However, the countries that are a part of it are doing very well. There's also the Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation, which was founded in 1989 at the suggestion of Australia, and it currently has 21 member countries. This includes the United States, Japan, and China. Most free trade areas haven't had the kind of success that the European Union and NAFTA have had in reducing trade barriers. However, it's clear that most countries are eager to come together to reduce trade barriers in an attempt to realize economic benefits of greater free trade. Now we transition to our next objective, which is conducting business internationally. And there are three basic strategies. Okay. The first thing that we need to do is we need to determine how important is it for a business to keep its costs down and prices low. Secondly, we need to determine how necessary is it for a company to customize or differentiate its product to adapt to a different customer taste and preferences around the world. In making these two determinations, we can determine the best strategy for conducting international business, or if we should be doing it at all. There are three main strategies. The first is called a global strategy. Okay? In a global strategy, businesses compete primarily on the basis of price while selling a standardized product. This means they do not change their product even when doing business outside of their domestic market. Okay? So they sell the product the same way they sell it at home, they sell it the same way abroad. But what they try to do is they try to lower cost so that they can then lower price and compete internationally with price. In a multi-domestic strategy, businesses compete primarily by customizing or differentiating the product to meet unique local needs, taste, or preferences. Firms pursuing a multi-domestic strategy face relatively low pressures for cost reduction. Customers want products that meet their needs or are distinct from the products of other competitors. So this is a pretty neat take, because if you can make your product unique enough, then foreign competitors can't really compete. And therefore, even if they try to mimic you, your consumers are going to see something about it that makes it worth paying the higher price. So we only fluctuate price if a competitor poses a threat. Lastly, we have transnational strategy, which is when businesses compete by offering a customized product while simultaneously selling at the lowest possible price. Typically, firms choose this when they face strong cost pressures, and strong pressures for differentiation. So this is when foreign companies are able to mimic or duplicate our unique products, or they are consistently coming up with new features that render ours obsolete. So we're constantly having to compete to differentiate as well. When that happens, we have to compete to customize our product, but we also have to keep our prices low simultaneously. It's the most difficult foreign strategy to have. So there's also strategies for entering foreign markets. So not strategies for doing business once you're there, but how to enter them specifically. When you do your homework or your research for your company project, these are the strategies that I hope that you will focus on, your strategies for entering the markets. Okay? So the first and most common strategy that most companies use when they're first trying to enter a foreign market is exporting. Exporting is the sale of a domestically produced good in a foreign market. Most businesses begin serving foreign markets this way, and then they might choose to switch to another mode only if they are first successful in exportation. Okay? A second approach is turnkey projects, which occur when firms export their technological know-how in exchange for a fee. Usually, this is for sophisticated and complex manufacturing. Once the facility is up and running, then local employees are trained, and then the keys are turned over and over to the foreign owners. Okay. Then there is the approach of franchising, and you might be familiar with that because we also have domestic franchising, and it's basically the same thing. It just happens overseas or in foreign countries. So franchising involves selling well-known brand names or proven methods of doing business to an investor in exchange for a fee or in exchange for a percentage of the sales or profits. Okay, franchising is actually really popular and will be discussed in more detail in Chapter 5. There's also licensing, which is sometimes confused with franchising, but it's not the same thing. Licensing is when a company signs an agreement in which the licensor has intangible property. And when we say intangible, we mean something that's not physical. And so intangible property tends to be like a patent, a trademark, a service mark, a copyright, a trade secret, or some other form of intellectual property that is then sold or made available to a licensee in exchange for a royalty fee. So it's when you're selling intellectual property for a fee. This is a little more dangerous than franchising because once you've sold that property, you're kind of giving up your autonomy or your authority over it. With a franchise, you still maintain a lot of the authority. So that's probably one of the biggest differences. Next up are joint ventures. This is where you're really starting to invest a significant amount of money abroad. And that's because when you do a joint venture, this involves shared ownership of a foreign subsidiary. Okay, so when we talk about international joint ventures, we're talking about a domestic company becoming a partner with a foreign company to do international business. So they team up, they find someone local who already knows the ways of the country, and they go into business together. And there are pros and cons associated with this type of dealing. And this is not to be confused with a strategic alliance. Okay? Strategic alliance is a cooperative arrangement. Okay? So unlike a joint venture, each partner retains its own business independence. So they are only in agreement to do business with one another for a specific period of time. Once that period of time is passed, they're not obligated to continue to do business with one another. Whereas with a joint venture, once you've agreed to do business with one another, you're stuck because you are partners in one business. So that's the biggest difference between those two. Okay. There's also contract manufacturing. This is when a firm subcontracts part or all of its goods to an outside firm as an alternative to owning or operating a foreign production facility. This is basically the same thing as offshoring, right? Because what we've done is we have shifted some part of our production away from domestic production, and we are subcontracting that out to a foreign entity to do that portion of our company's business. The last one that we see here is called a wholly owned subsidiary. This is the highest form of foreign investment because this involves actually establishing a foreign facility owned and entirely operated by a domestic firm. Okay, so that would be like instead of partnering up with somebody that's already overseas in a particular company, that would be a domestic company actually buying land, creating a facility, hiring workers, and doing business in a foreign country. That is the most expensive form of entering a foreign market. This slide highlights all of the advantages and disadvantages of each way that a business can enter a foreign market. I'm not going to read every one of these bullet points, so I do want you to pause if you need to and read over them. But what you should know is that the optimal entry method depends on a lot of different factors. This includes the firm's strategy, the three strategies that we already discussed. Each company or each business must weigh the advantages against the disadvantages when making this decision. For example, while exporting is a quick way to enter a market, transportation costs can be very high, or franchises transfer the risk of business to the franchisee, but it can be difficult to maintain quality control over franchises in other countries because it's difficult to just swoop in and see how things are going, right? Because they're overseas. Another example is joint ventures. So, in a joint venture, when a company takes on a partner, it's really difficult to end that partnership. Um, they can combine their knowledge and resources, but then they are giving up 50% of the control that they have over their company, right? And so then they have to work with the other leads of the other company, and there's a lot of compromise that happens. So there's a lot of risk there. So these are just some examples of the advantages and disadvantages that have to be weighed. And remember, economically, we hope to find a conclusion where the benefits outweigh the cost. So benefits would be advantages, costs would be disadvantages. We also have to talk about foreign exchange. So foreign exchange markets determine foreign exchange rates. These are the rates at which currencies are converted from one country's currency to another. Depending on a firm's perspective, it may prefer to a strong or weak US dollar, right? So US exporters, that would be companies that are exporting goods away from the United States towards other countries, prefer a weak US dollar, which it seems counterintuitive, but it's actually true. They prefer a weak dollar because that means that their products will be more affordable to foreign consumers, right? Because what happens is when those goods are sold in other markets, they can keep their prices lower because the dollar is devalued. However, US importers, right? So those companies who are importing goods prefer a strong dollar. Why? Because the cost of importing foreign goods will then be cheaper. And if importing foreign goods is cheaper, then they are able to realize savings, right? Because they are passed on to the consumer, or they are able to generate higher profit margins. So there's a lot more that's going on when we talk about exchange rates than meets the eye. This also leads to a discussion on trade deficits or trade surpluses. Okay, a trade deficit happens when the value of a country's imports exceeds the value of its exports. A surplus happens when the value of a country's exports exceeds its imports, so the opposite. Well, one of the main factors that influences whether or not a country experiences a deficit or a surplus is the exchange rate. When a country has a fixed exchange rate, that rate can be manipulated or fixed by the government. For example, China has fixed its currency to a rate that makes it weak compared to the US dollar. Okay? This is the opposite of having a freely floating or flexible exchange rate. Okay? When we have a freely floating or flexible exchange rate, the global supply and demand for currency is what determines that rate, right? So that means that, when goods are being exported or imported at higher levels, the exchange rate flows, it correspondingly flows up and down along with that supply and demand. There are some other factors that influence exchange rates. And currencies that are non-convertible. and this involves counter trade. So many developing countries have what we call non-convertible currency. That is a currency that can't be converted into another country's exchange or currency. Why would that happen? Well, in developing countries, if you go back and look at the protectionist area of this lecture, they talk about infant industries. And when you have an infant industry, what you're trying to do is you're trying to keep currency inside the country. You're trying to keep consumers from spending that money elsewhere. You want them to spend it in your domestic economy so that they can fuel that infant industry. Well, one way a government can do that is to make their currency non-convertible. So, if I'm a foreign business person and I come to that country and I do business and I get some of their currency, I also have to spend that currency while I'm there. If I leave, I can't convert it back to my own domestic currency. Okay? This protects against what we call capital flight, which is where a country's domestic funds are exchanged to foreign funds outside that country, right? And by forcing that currency to stay in that country, it fuels the domestic economy. And we talked about the advantages and disadvantages of making this happen. There's also counter trade, which is a form of international barter, or the swapping of goods and services for other goods and services. Okay, this is conducted out of necessity or for enhanced profitability, but it also impacts the exchange rate in foreign trade. Okay, so if going back to what we were discussing with China, the United States has a freely floating exchange rate and allows all these different factors that impact the supply and demand of our goods to also impact our exchange rate. What we don't like is we don't like countries like China who are artificially holding their currency down, which makes the cost of goods and the cost of labor and services and other things cheaper there. Because what it does is it drives businesses to do foreign businesses to do business in China because it makes the cost of business cheaper in doing so. So hopefully that makes sense. That explains probably some of the news stories that you've heard about over the past few years. Let's see. Okay, so there are many other economic challenges to conducting international business. Many developing countries are experiencing rapid growth and are experiencing more rapid growth than advanced economies are, with eager new customers ready to buy products and services. However, these countries may still lack the basic infrastructure needed for transportation, utilities, communications, and other forms of technology. Government economic policies and the economic environment can pose challenges. So, international businesses prefer free market economies to state-run or socialized economies because the bureaucratic hassles associated with, uh, the costs associated with government intervention. So, the debt load of a nation, its unemployment or inflation rate, and its fiscal and monetary policies will impact whether or not businesses want to do business with that country. There are also socioeconomic factors that impact these decisions. They include the demographics of a population, the age distribution, birth rates, income distribution, ethnicity, and the cultures and behaviors of that economy. So all of these things factor into the decisions of whether or not to enter a particular country and do business. So we've talked about this before. What do we mean by culture? Well, we mean a complex set of values, behaviors, lifestyles, arts, beliefs, and institutions of a population that are passed on from generation to generation. Uh, your book talks about cross-cultural awareness, which is an understanding and appreciation and a sensitivity to foreign culture. Okay, your book also discusses ethnocentrism, which is a belief that one's own culture is superior to others. This is a guaranteed recipe for disaster when seeking to do international business. And Americans have learned about this particular type of approach the best and how to avoid it. Okay, so we see various cultural challenges. First, we see aesthetics, which refers to what is considered beautiful or in good taste. We have to realize that what one country or one culture might deem beautiful or good taste might not necessarily be the same in all cultures or all countries. Aesthetics encompasses etiquette, customs, and protocol. There's also differences in attitudes towards time and work. Some countries believe that you should always be on time and that there's a certain level of etiquette involved when it comes to doing business. Other countries are more laid back and care more about personal relationships than they do business relationships. Um, there's also a lot that goes into religion. Some companies place higher value on religion, and it takes a role in how they do business. Okay, and if you are doing business in those nations, you want to make sure that you don't offend those folks or even the customers when you are selling to them, doing business with them, establishing marketing campaigns, and more. And lastly, there is language. Remember that when we discuss language, we don't just mean verbal, we mean nonverbal. Our nonverbal cues are interpreted very differently in other countries. Okay, so it's very important to study and understand what our nonverbal cues mean, uh, in other parts of the world. Okay, all of these are very important when considering doing business elsewhere. And there's an exercise that we tend to do when we are considering doing business elsewhere. Your book talks about the political, ethical, and legal exercise. There's actually a few more. In higher levels of business, we call it the PESTLE exercise, which stands for political, ethical, socioeconomic, technological, uh, environmental, and legal. So it factors in a few more. Okay. What you should know is that there are many political challenges to conducting international business. These businesses thrive in nations that have a firm commitment to free market principles with stable, democratically elected governments. When we have well established educational systems and well maintained infrastructures, we tend to see higher probabilities of successful business in foreign nations. Unfortunately, there are a lot of legal challenges to conducting international business. There are laws, regulatory standards, and finding access to unbiased judicial systems when we try to do business abroad. Unfortunately, there's no such thing as universal law. There's also no such thing as universal regulatory standards or global courts that exist to dispute global economic practices. When we do business abroad, we have to deal with different governing contracts, different product safety and liability standards, different property rights, and these are all of very high importance when we consider doing business abroad because we need to look into these things before we decide to do business elsewhere. And this also leads to ethical challenges. Bribery is probably one of the best examples. While bribery is illegal in the United States, it's not necessarily illegal in all other countries. That doesn't mean that it isn't unethical. So, what we've seen in the past is we've seen where U.S. companies have gone to do business abroad and have been found guilty of bribery and felt like they were justified in doing so because bribery was okay in another country. But then you have to ask yourself, if it's not okay in my country, why should I do it in another country just because they say it's okay there, right? And as you can imagine, this can bleed over into a number of other ethical violations, right? So another example would be child labor. It is illegal to have child labor in the US, but it's not necessarily illegal elsewhere. So if I'm a business and I'm seeking uh, to do business in that foreign country, do I suddenly think it's okay to use child labor? It's not illegal there, but will my consumers in my domestic country um, critique me for that? Will they stop doing business with me for that? And so, businesses have to decide whether or not they're willing to defy their ethical codes to make larger profits abroad. Um, However, they could be sacrificing uh, business domestically. So these are all factors that we have to consider as well. All right, and we have made it to the end of the chapter. Okay, so just to summarize, we did discuss the globalization of markets, the globalization of production. We discussed offshoring, outsourcing, right? The decline of trade barriers, right? The rapid increase in foreign investment and free trade. Uh, we talked about the cost and benefits of international trade. We talked about the theories of absolute and comparative advantage, uh, the different types of trade barriers that exist that governments can use. We discussed strategies for doing business abroad. We also discussed strategies for entry into foreign markets. We discussed foreign exchange rates. We discussed other economic factors that play a role in doing business abroad. And we discussed the sociocultural or socioeconomic, political, legal, and ethical challenges of doing business abroad. So that's a lot. Um, I hope that you got a lot out of this lecture. I hope that you know you absorb it before you try to do your research on your company for this week. And again, please shoot me a message if you need any help or need further clarification on any of these topics. All right, we'll see you next time.